Hello everyone, this will be a guide on what to look out for in crankset upgrade options available for the Brompton, but also know that I'm glossing over some very bike nerdy details which aren't as relevant. The Brompton is actually compatible with a lot of cranks and bottom brackets, shares the same bottom bracket threading and shell width as a lot of other bikes. So this is the crank arm, this is the chainring, this is the bottom bracket in this situation. Some square taper bottom brackets don't stick out like this. I'll show you an example in a picture. There's also some chain rings also have chainring bolts, but this one is like it's called a direct mount, so it mounts directly to the crank arm. It has like a pattern there to lock it in, and this whole assembly with the crank arm, the chain ring, the bottom bracket is called the chain set or crank set. So why would you want to chain your cranks? First, there's different chainring options. You can fit dual chain rings or a chainring smaller than 39 teeth. There are a lot more options, and you don't have to pay the Brompton premium for Brompton specific parts that fit the Brompton cranks. Also, the 130 BCD on the Brompton only lets you go 38 teeth as the smallest. If you want something smaller, then something like a 110 BCD is a bit better. Second, there's a lot of different crank length options. Shorter riders might prefer shorter cranks, which can help with pedaling ergonomics. The standard Brompton cranks are 170 millimeters, which are a bike industry standard. The trend today is towards shorter cranks, which can help reduce knee and hip strain, especially for riders with shorter legs or those with hip mobility issues. Third, there's weight savings. There are some relatively affordable and lightweight options out there. If you stick with the square taper bottom bracket, you can get lighter bottom brackets and different square taper cranks, but I personally prefer changing out the bottom bracket to one of the more modern standards, which now have widely accessible carbon cranks. Fourth, higher quality. The bottom bracket that Brompton supplies, other than the T-line, is pretty terrible, so even if you change to a different standard, there are still a lot of better options out there for a drop-in replacement. And lastly, aesthetics, but that's pretty personal. So let's talk in more detail about each part of the chain set. For the bottom bracket, all Bromptons other than the T-line come with a square taper bottom bracket, which comes attached with the spindles and axles. The T-line bottom bracket uses a more modern standard where the spindle is attached to the crank, but all Brompton frames use the same BSA 68 bottom bracket standard. So yeah, this is the bottom bracket shell width, and it's 68. So some people have also noted that since the Brompton bottom bracket isn't meant for these type of screw-in bottom brackets, that the surface might need to be faced to be perfectly flat. I mean, I've tried this probably on like 3 Bromptons now, and I haven't had an issue with like an uneven surface causing unequal wear on the axle. Side note, the T-line uses the FSA BSA Mega Evo 386 road bike bottom bracket. Brompton sells it directly where they obfuscate the model number, or you can just find it elsewhere for half the price. If you want to keep it simple, it might be easier to stick with the square taper bottom bracket and change crank arms to fit smaller chain rings or have different crank lengths. But if you want to save more weight, moving away from the square taper bottom bracket is better. Some people just upgrade to a higher quality or lighter titanium bottom bracket, which can save weight. A common upgrade is the Shimano UN300 bottom bracket with 119mm axles, which have higher quality bearings than the standard Brompton one. Note that the modern square taper bottom bracket standard is now called JIS. If the cranks or bottom bracket don't specify JIS or the older ISO standard, it's probably JIS. For a drop-in replacement, the axle length needs to be 119 millimeters. But if you want to do a dual chainring setup, you will probably need a wider bottom bracket, something around 125 millimeters or wider, which will give enough clearance for the inner chainring. The other option is ditching the square taper standard for a newer style crankset that has the spindle separated from the bottom bracket. Most modern road bikes use this type of crank, so there's more innovation here in terms of lightweight carbon cranks. The most important thing is to make sure that it has BSA threading. There are other bottom brackets that have different thread diameters or press fit, which won't work. Another thing to note is a lot of 73mm bottom brackets are actually just 68mm with a couple spacers. But it is worth looking at the specifications on the box, or just buying the bottom bracket that comes in a kit with the cranks, which means you'll be using spacers between the bottom bracket cup and the bottom bracket shell. This is common and nothing to worry about, and allows you to make adjustments to the chain line and clearance for folding. One other specification to keep in mind is the spindle diameter, which will tell you what type of crank it is compatible with. Again, when you choose your cranks, it will tell you which standard. There are pros and cons to each, but honestly, for a normal cyclist, where you're not eking out every bit of performance, the difference is minimal. Next is the crank arms themselves. Regarding square taper cranks, there are still a lot of options for crank arms with different lengths. Chainring standards are also simpler. You'll generally have chainrings mounted via 4 or 5 bolts. but I would recommend a 4 or 5 bolt pattern with 110 BCD. You can also get dual chainring options. Just keep in mind that you'll need longer bottom bracket axles mentioned above. Now let's talk about non-square taper crank options. A lot of the third-party cheaper cranks I look at on AliExpress try to be as universal as possible. I'm mainly referring to the axle width here. For our Brompton needs, axle widths of around 115 millimeters is fine.
So these are cruise bike cranks that I got from AliExpress. I'll just measure this spindle axle length so you get an idea. So these ones are 109.4. One thing to note is a lot of these also have this collar that you loosen this set screw and it lets you kind of fine tune the tightness of the crank. So this also gives you a little bit of adjustment.
Another thing to look out for are cranks labeled for road bike or for mountain bike. These days the spindle widths are generally similar. The difference is that mountain bike crank arms have a wider Q factor, which is the distance between the pedals. This is accomplished by having crank arms that are curved outwards a bit more than road crank arms. Could be good if a bike fit recommends a wider Q factor. Another standard to consider is the spindle diameter, but again, I wouldn't let spindle diameter be a determining factor. But going back to the advantages of third-party cranks in general, one of the big advantages is the ability to choose shorter or longer crank arms, so look out for crank arms that offer those options. Cranks also have different standards for attaching different chain rings. A lot of carbon cranks use somewhat proprietary mounting standards, which is annoying, but most will have an option for a spider adapter for more standard chainring bolt standards. Definitely look for cranks that offer the spider adapter option, and you might want to pick up one just in case so you aren't limited to proprietary chain rings. I would also look for cranks that have a good direct mount option for dual chain rings. It's better to have the option instead of relying on a spider adapter and getting a dual chainring to fit the adapter. And lastly, the chainring. There are a ton of standards and options out there, but once you decide on the crank arms, you only need to think about the chainring that fits your cranks. Non-square taper cranks often have their own direct mount chainring standard, but they do usually offer a spider adapter, so you aren't necessarily locked into a proprietary system. For chainrings that attach via chainring bolts, there are several standards as well. There are generally 3 bolt circle diameters, or BCD. You will see 104, 110, and 130, which, as the name suggests, describes the diameter that the chainring bolt pattern forms. Note that these BCD also come with different patterns. Some are 4 bolt, some are 5, some are evenly or unevenly spaced. It should be fairly obvious from looking at the photos. I would say 110 BCD with 4 or 5 bolts is a good middle ground, with a lot of availability of chainring options. Also, if you're sticking with a single chainring, you should look into getting a narrow wide chainring which has teeth that are shaped to avoid chain drops. Chain drops are somewhat rare with the type of riding normal Brompton riders do, but it doesn't hurt. Chainrings also come in different widths to accommodate different chains. For example, the pre-4-speed drivetrain uses an 8-speed chain, but the new 4-speed and 12-speed drivetrains use an 11-speed chain. Just make sure that if you're changing a 4-speed or 12-speed crankset, go with an 11-speed compatible chainring. One other specification on chainrings is the offset, which adjusts the chain line. I would say start of 0.
So I just wanted to give you an example here of the chain line. So it's quite straight.
If you need to adjust the chain line, you can buy a chainring with different offset. So let's get to the fun part with some recommendations. A dual chainring upgrade without a front derailleur is a popular upgrade for those who take their Bromptons touring or on longer trips. You just manually drop the chain into the lower gear when you need the hill climbing ability and move it back up when the climbing is over. You can do this by using either your fingers or using a stick. For carbon cranks, I recommend the rear row carbon cranks that look like this. It is 585 grams for a dual chainring 50-34 tooth setup and costs about 136 pounds. This does not include a bottom bracket, which you can get for another 11 pounds and weighs 80 grams. So the entire crankset is 665 grams for about 147 pounds. Now let's look at the square taper option. I recommend the Ultralight Impact E. It comes in a variety of crank length sizes and dual chainring options. It's hard to find the exact weight. From what I've seen online, the weight ranges from 675 grams to 770 grams, but it doesn't specify the crank arm length or chainring size. So let's just say 700 grams. And it costs 62 pounds right now for the crank arms and chainring, but it is on sale. I found this titanium bottom bracket with 122mm width for 27 pounds, and it weighs 211 grams. I'm not sure if 122mm is wide enough, but Shimano also offers a standard steel square taper bottom bracket with 127.5mm width. So for a dual chainring square taper option, you're looking at 911 grams for 90 pounds, which is about 60 grams heavier than a standard Brompton 50-tooth single chainring setup. If you go with the wider Shimano bottom bracket, you're looking at around 1 kilogram for the square taper dual chainring option. So just comparing the square taper and non-square taper option, you can kind of see why I tend to lean towards the non-square taper option. The price difference is about 60 pounds right now, but the weight saving is about 250 grams for the non-square taper option. Either option, you're getting a lot more functionality with either a minor weight penalty or significant weight savings compared to the standard Brompton offerings. Alternatively, if you want to maximize weight savings and only use a single chainring, I recommend this carbon crank setup. The Rock Bros carbon cranks are 196 pounds, but only weigh 320 grams. Add an 80-gram bottom bracket for 11 pounds, a 42-tooth chainring which weighs around 92 grams and costs 27 pounds, and you have a crankset that weighs 492 grams and costs 234 pounds. The T-Line crankset is also a purchasable upgrade for 250 pounds, so this third-party option is about the same price, but 250 grams lighter. And as a side note, I don't recommend these Rock Bro cranks for dual chainring setup because the Easton direct mount that it uses doesn't have a good unibody dual chainring, so you'd end up having to get a spider and then adapting 2 chainrings to it. And it just negates the weight savings of the lighter cranks. You might as well go with the rear row cranks that have the nice dual unibody chainring, which would end up being a lighter setup. This is the setup I run on my Brompton, except it was 40 pounds cheaper when I bought it. It's still a great deal since I think if you want anything approaching or surpassing this weight from a brand with a more high-end reputation, you're paying 3 or 4 times more in price. There are also some lighter square taper options from brands like H&H. This setup will come out a bit more expensive once you factor in the chainring and will be about 100 grams heavier than the carbon non-square taper option mentioned above. So unless you personally like the aesthetics of metal crank arms, I do not see any reason for sticking with the square taper bottom bracket. I guess the one downside to mention about these third-party chainrings is that most don't have a chain guard to keep your trousers from getting dirty. Well, I tried to keep this video concise, but I hope these last few recommendations give you a solid foundation to work off of in your upgrading adventures. Anyways, this is the end of the video, and hopefully this was helpful, and hope you like and subscribe for more videos like this where I go over upgrades and talk about my experience with all these different parts that I've tried.